Friday, July 21. Further thought. Underlying the epistle to the Ephesians is a story that is often rehearsed in part or alluded to in it. The major events in the narrative are the following. 1. God's choice of the people before the foundation of the world. We find that in Ephesians 1 verses 4, 5 and 11. 2. Their past lost existence, we read about at the beginning of chapter 2 and towards the end, chapter 4 towards the end, and chapter 5 verse 8. 3. The intervention of God in Christ to save them, we read in the first chapter, the second chapter, the fourth chapter, the fifth chapter. 4. Their acceptance of the gospel. We read about that in chapter 1, and it's implied elsewhere in that chapter. Having once no hope in chapter 2, they now possess the one hope toward which believers move in chapter 4 and chapter 1. And 5. The present lives of the addressees as disciples. Though living at a time fraught with hazards and the opposition of the evil powers, they may draw on the resources offered by their exalted Lord, as you read in Ephesians 1, 15-23, chapter 2, verse 6, chapter 3, verses 14-21, chapter 4, verses 7-16, and chapter 6, verses 10-20. And 6. In the future culmination of history, the Spirit's role as guarantee we find in Ephesians 1 verses 13 and 14, or seal in chapter 4 verse 30, reaches fruition. In this crowning moment, the addressees will be rewarded for their faithfulness by taking possession of the inheritance already granted to them in Christ, as we've read in chapter 2, and we'll read later in chapter 6. And through their faith in Christ, they will be granted a place in the Christ-centered age to come. We read that in chapter 1:21, 2:7, 2:19-22, chapter 4, verses 13 and 15, and chapter 5, verse 27. And that brings us to our discussion questions for this week. 1. The underlying story of Ephesians is not just the story of believers in the first century. It is our own story. Which of the major steps or stages of that story gives you the most hope in this moment? 2. Why do you think it is that Paul so frequently recalls the sinful past of his audience, inviting them to reflect on their pre-conversion lives? 3. Compare Paul's summary of the gospel in Ephesians 2, 8-10 to his earlier summary in Romans 1, 16 and 17. What similar themes emerge? In what ways are they different? Let's have a look. Ephesians 2, beginning at verse 8. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand, that we should walk in them. And then Romans 1, beginning at verse 16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. And 4. While the good works of believers play no role in their redemption, in that they can never give people saving merit before God, what important part do they play in God's plans for believers? Ephesians 2 verse 10, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. And for today's Inside Story, here's Sibylla. Thank you, Sibylla.
Terrified in Russia, Part 1, by Andrew McChesney. Unusual events began occurring at home after 16-year-old Elmira signed up for courses on the supernatural in the Russian Republic of Bashkortostan. The year was 1992. The Soviet Union had collapsed the previous year, and public interest was high in once banned religion. 2 Russians from Moscow showed up at Elmira's school in the city of Sibay and offered extracurricular courses on extrasensory perception. Elmira's parents forbade Elmira from attending the courses. The Russian teachers, however, promised to reveal amazing secrets, including how to heal illnesses. Mother had suffered headaches for some time, and Elmira wanted to help her, so she secretly attended the courses. She was taught that she was surrounded by invisible good and evil forces, and, if she mastered them, she could perform wonders. Alone at home, she attempted to put into practice what she was learning. She carried out a one-sided conversation with unseen forces in her home, saying that she wanted to control them. That night, when she turned off the light to go to bed, she sensed a presence in the room. After a while, the presence manifested itself during the day when she was at home alone. Sometimes she noticed a shadow running past a window. She was not afraid. She thought that she was strong and was on her way to controlling an invisible force. As time passed, she realized to her chagrin that the force was stronger than her. She could not control it. Frightened, she stopped turning off the lights when she went to bed at night. She was afraid to sleep. When she finally slept, she had terrifying nightmares. In desperation, Elmira asked Mother to sleep with her, but Mother refused after a few days. She said she was having nightmares. Over the next 6 months, Elmira's life turned upside down. Her grades suffered, and she seemed to be in constant conflict with teachers, friends, and her parents. She grew terrified. She didn't know where to turn. You can read more about Elmira next week. Thank you for your mission offerings that help spread the gospel in Russia and around the world.
This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. And you can listen and watch at the same time on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful.